We're talking about, the future of digital supply chain post-COVID, right? I can remember speaking to some of my customers 365 days ago who had manufacturing and supply base operations in China and hearing them just in complete stress of we're not even going to be able to ship product this quarter. I mean, we're calling our suppliers and nobody is answering the phones. It's like what is happening? And as the weeks went on, we all remember here in the States, kind of that mid-March timeframe when within 2 or 3 days, everybody was working from home. And, the customers that I was talking to then were just trying to reconfigure tablets that were meant to be at the manufacturing sites for people's home office use so that they could keep working. Because they didn't have enough laptops to send everybody. So just what happened with with last year? I think what we saw is the trends and the important supply chain focuses that we've been talking about for 5 to 10 years: agility, speed, responsiveness. We saw a global strain that put companies who had not invested in those things at a severe disadvantage from companies who had invested in those things. And so where companies were, probably everybody listening on the phone today experienced at least two of the three following things, right? Either severe demand fluctuations, where in a lot of industries you had within a couple of days consumers purchasing 4 weeks worth of products in one day, or at the same time severe supply constraints with either outbreaks happening at their manufacturing sites, supplier sites. Everybody experienced now a format of working that they were not used to, namely people working in their houses. And so supply chains who had not invested in where we had not invested in agility, in responsiveness and speed, it probably felt a lot like this, where the the need to get the products to the customer did not change, and if anything, they became more intense. But we had to change the wheels of the tire of the car while still driving it, right? And it's probably always felt a little bit like this in supply chain, but maybe last year it felt like the car was going uphill in a snowstorm, and we were still trying to do this, right? So I think the number one thing that emerged from our perspective in the industry is that we need to be able to make decisions faster. We need to be able to understand what's going on, be able to adapt to circumstances so that we can get our product to our customer. And when we talk about applying service management to exceptions, that's exactly what we're talking about doing. And I think we've all been to conferences over the last 5 years, and or last 5 to 10 years or whatever. And the common solution to dealing with exceptions or issues that come up is that we need to be better at planning. Our planning needs to be more integrated, more real time, more responsive. But planning is not the right framework for dealing with the issues that we saw. The lead times are too fast. There are too many different players involved, and it is just a different model needs to be adapted. That planning is not the answer to solving these issues. And our perspective is that you have to invest in planning. It doesn't make sense to not have integrated planning and advanced planning systems. But there are circumstances that have come up that that are straining that design and that capacity. So what are we talking about? Well, in the supply chain technology stack, we see sort of three different layers. So starting at the bottom layer, you have the planning and execution systems. These are the systems that are critical, as I just said, to running the business. You have to have planning systems, you have to have execution systems. And we've all invested a lot in those systems. Companies have now also invested a lot in visibility, which are giving teams across the supply chain visibility to those assets. Where's my stuff? Early indicators of problems going wrong. And we have billions of dollars running through these different systems. But then when it comes to managing these issues, when it comes to managing these exceptions, and when things go wrong, we have hundreds of millions of dollars in processes being run in email, and Excel spreadsheets. And what's the problem with that? I mean, we all like our email and our Excel spreadsheets. Well, we see these issues. Um, we see the issues with this when things go wrong, right? Excel is very difficult to create cross-functional and cross-departmental visibility. Email makes it very difficult for people to prioritize and follow with a structured process. It's very free form. And so the result of that is processes are slowed down. We don't make decisions as quickly as we should. And so service level and costs are incurred that do not need to be. And so where we talk about applying an actual platform, Elementum's perspective is that you need a more digitized solution to run these different processes. That it is no longer sufficient to have a lot of digital investments in the bottom two layers of the tech stack, which again are necessary. But there's a game of diminishing returns the more you invest in those areas, because we've been investing in them for 10 years. But the low-hanging fruit is in investing in digital solutions in the service management layer. And so what are we talking about? What are the actual processes that we're talking about? Well, these are things that we're all used to dealing with. These are the fires that we're fighting constantly, continuously, and they span the gamut within the supply chain functional areas, right? You've got plan, source, make, deliver, return, a framework that we're probably all familiar with. But within these frameworks, there are lots of exceptions that we deal with. So in planning, we're dealing with stockouts, we're dealing with obsolescence. If you're in CPG or food and beverage, you're probably used to these retailers jacking up their OTIF requirements, right? In Europe, Canada, the US, this is a huge problem. And these retailers are getting more and more aggressive with regard to fines and penalties. These are examples of exceptions, things going wrong. In the make sphere, right? We're all trying to make sure that we have clear to build, we have enough materials on hand, enough capacity. So there are exception management processes, again, that are happening all the time and that are being run on email and Excel. And so what we want to do is we want to start to digitize and centralize these processes. And depending on which processes you're talking about, there are different impacts to the business. In the planning space, it's protecting lost revenue. In sourcing and make, it may be protecting from unnecessary costs or ensuring supplier compliance. But the key principle across all of these different areas is that you need to have one single source of truth for managing any of these processes. And that single source of truth needs to give your functional leaders the ability to measure these processes. How long does it take us to resolve stockouts? How many quality control issues have we had for a particular supplier? And what has that cost us in return fees or in manufacturing line slowdowns, right? These are processes that you have that data today, but the problem is it's in people's email accounts. And so what we want to do is we want to start measuring those processes so that we can actually perform improvement and continuous improvement principles on those processes. And so think of it as the way to bring somewhat of a ticketing approach to the supply chain space, where other functions like IT or customer service have a very robust and mature process around dealing with issues or incidents. You can bring that same level of process maturity in the firefighting that we've been used to in supply chain for so long. And so every team member of the supply chain, whether you're a buyer dealing with late purchase orders, whether you're a planner who's dealing with supply shortages, or whether you're in logistics trying to triage OTIF penalties, you can have a single source of truth for managing any of your exceptions in one place. And so that exception management, when we talk about exception management, also needs to span across different stakeholder groups within your company, and it needs to span across beyond your four walls. And so having the capability to actually collaborate with your suppliers and your manufacturing partners and even your carriers, 3PLs, customers, all in one workspace is something that has been critical in digitizing this top layer of the service management stack that we've been talking about. And the reason that layer exists is because that collaboration that's so necessary and so important cannot happen in a financial system. It cannot happen in a transactional system because we cannot give these third parties access to these systems. And so we've relied on pulling data out of those systems, collaborating via email, which has all the negative results that we've been talking about. But if you have a platform approach that you've layered on to those other areas, you can actually extend out that collaboration to these different groups. So let's talk about a couple examples, because I think it's always helpful to see real life customer examples of this. So let's talk about GCC. So GCC is a North America based manufacturer of cement and concrete, and they have a very network constraint supply chain. They build materials and products that are extremely heavy, high volume, and so they have to transport these materials via rail. And obviously, there's a lot of interdependencies within a rail network, because if one part of it shuts down, it affects your part of the network, et cetera, et cetera. But they also have a lot of seasonality issues, right? So if the warm months of a summer extend into September, October, their customers have projects that are continuing that would require additional materials from GCC that they maybe didn't plan for. So there are a lot of variables that they have to deal with. And GCC is a great example in this theme of planning versus execution, because in 2019, they invested heavily in their S&OP process. They did a full revamp, probably a lot of you have gone through that or are going through that, where they've integrated their sales and operations planning processes. And what they found is that there were exceptions that were happening post-plan that they were, again, managing in email and Excel and phone calls. And these issues were around, stockouts and service levels and things like that. And so last year, they decided to invest in their exception management process. They recognized that planning could never get them to 100%. And so with a solution that helped them bring all of those exception management processes together in a platform, they were able to prevent stockouts from affecting their customers 74% of the time. And they attributed $300 million of revenue protection being run through those exception management processes. Let's take another example that has, maybe a good relevance to COVID is Vitamix. You probably all heard of Vitamix. They're a kitchen appliance manufacturer, and they were seeing a lot of demand increases during spring of 2020. And a lot of that was attributable to people working from home more, cooking from home more. And so I remember a story where they had a Mother's Day promotion and their sales were 20% higher than their forecast, right? So demand fluctuation. At the same time, their manufacturing base overseas was completely shut down. And so they were getting hit from both sides, right? They had, the demand fluctuations, they had the supply constraints. And so they needed a way to quickly make decisions around how to allocate, what to do, how to spin up an additional supplier. And using the exception management process in a digital format, they were able to make sure that teams across 7 different functions, demand planning, supply planning, manufacturing, procurement, customer service, all these different functions were working together in one workspace where they could clearly communicate escalations and protect revenue. And so this is one where they, instead of having all these meetings where they're firefighting and trying to figure it out, they were able to work more efficiently, working in a virtual format, and actually make those decisions more quickly. Let's take another example. Maybe a company that's more in the high growth stage, McGee. McGee is a consumer goods company. They manufacture and distribute furniture. And they had an increase in customer complaints and service claims. And they're a small team, so they didn't have a good way of keeping track of all these claims and attributing a fault to a supplier or a carrier. And so they were incurring a lot of the costs associated with these complaints on themselves. Well, using exception management and a service management platform, they were able to actually start issuing claims to carriers and keeping them accountable. If there was a customer complaint because of damage, and they found out through their investigation process that it was because the carrier dropped the package, we can issue a claim to the carrier. Similarly, if it's a manufacturing defect, they can actually issue those claims to the suppliers. And so rather than keeping those processes run via email and Excel, they had a way to organize themselves around those processes and keep track of every single issue so that they could ensure that they were keeping their partners accountable. And so this is just another example of them protecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in just the course of a few months. So in terms of how to start, right? You can think of this map as sort of a heat map. There are different hotspots. There are different pain points in every organization. Some of you listening may have a really good process for managing stockouts today, and that's not even an issue. Uh, Maybe some who are listening have less mature processes for managing inbound late purchase orders from suppliers or purchase orders that show up and they have a defect or something like this. And so what we always recommend to customers is just start with one process. Um, pick a pain point in the organization, pick a process that has a high frequency of issues and that has a direct financial impact that requires cross collaboration, that requires collaboration across different functions, and just start with that process. And so, you know, that's always the best place to start. And then what we find is that when customers start to onboard one process, the second, third, and fourth quickly follow as other teams start to see the ways that they're able to mature their process. Other teams will always raise their hand and sign on board. Um, and then in terms of how do you actually do this? It's a very streamlined and structured approach, right? So what we always do is what we call a proof of value. And the nice thing about this is that you can run a proof of value with with no IT, with no integrations needed, and start maturing and running a more digital process for managing exceptions. And so what we typically do is, a brief discovery session. We'll actually do a demonstration of that exception management process and let the teams actually try it out and run the process on the system. And so it's a really nice way of getting the team's hands on a new solution, running a new process, and trying it without any risk up front. And so we have a lot of confidence in, number one, our ability to actually onboard customers really quickly. Again, with no IT, usually after one session, you're fully onboarded and able to run that process, and our ability to achieve value in a shorter period of time, which has enabled us to run these proof of values at scale. And so, with that, we would invite all of you, if you have questions, reach out, join the movement. This is a thing that a lot of the top brands within the industry are getting on board, recognizing that they need to invest in more digital solutions as it relates to exception management, and ones that we've been able to work with a lot of really great customers so far, and we have a lot of confidence that we'll be able to continue working with more great customers in the future.